Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one of my favorite movies. Not just one of my favorite Disney movies or my favorite animated movies, but one of my favorite movies, period. It's also one of the most influential and important movies ever made. For good reason, too. The movie is aesthetically beautiful, easily accessible, has a large emotional palette, and is endlessly charming. Unfortunately, it's a film that doesn't seem to get its fair share of praise outside of animation historians and Disney fan circles, something which I find to be a crying shame, as it's a film that deserves much more than ridicule by people who see it as a simpler alternative to the newer Disney catalog, not to mention parody from over half of that aforementioned catalog. Is it because I just love older cartoons that I took so strongly to it when I first watched it in 2018? I don't know. I had wanted to watch it since 2014, but the most I could find on the internet at the time was a joke Bambi article that I don't even think exists anymore. For me, anyway, it was certainly one of those cases where I realized that a film was much more of a masterpiece than I previously thought. I fell absolutely in love with this movie, and I've seen it more times than I care to admit at this point. So the only obvious move was to create some sort of love letter, editorial essay, explaining why the film was more of a big deal than some people might realize by today's standards, right? Well, even if not, I would love it if you would humor me for a while. As mentioned earlier, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one of the most important and influential films ever made. If I were to break down why in passing, I would probably say it's because of the expressiveness of the characters and artwork, the evolution of the identity of what animation was at the time, and help establish and save one of the most important animation houses in the world. While it stands in quite stark contrast to the newer Broadway-esque counterparts, both styles of Disney animation are good for very different reasons, although the origins of the film are more tied to the stage than most think. A young Walt Disney and his paperboy companions being invited to watch a very primitive recording of a stage play of Snow White is where the producer first got the idea. That idea continued to evolve and brew in Walt's head while he worked on the Alice comedies in the early 1920s, and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit for Universal later that same decade. Even though the combination of Walt Disney and many talented artists and animators helped create what was, at the time, a very successful IP, the hopes of getting a pay raise and requesting one in the midst of success resulted in Walt being fired from his position at Universal, which is pretty ironic if you think about Disney's later history involving a similar ordeal in the 50s. The only animator that followed Walt on his way out was Ub Iwerks, a madman of an animator who was able to complete a very large amount of work extraordinarily quickly. He is also one of the animators that helped define the 12 principles of animation, something any animator worth their salt, or with enough time on their hands during production, should follow. Ub Iwerks is someone who unfortunately not many people know about nowadays. Again, unless one happens to be an animation historian, student, or a Disney superfan. Which again is quite a shame. He helped animate many of the Walt Disney Company's early successes, completely by himself. This includes the first few Mickey Mouse cartoons, Plain Crazy and Steamboat Willie. I felt the need to highlight the man because he is so much more important than just the person who helped Walt Disney at one point in time. A good chunk of the video game Cuphead is essentially a tribute to his work. I had the shock and surprise of learning that the falling out between him and Walt in the early 30s came from not only the feeling that he wasn't getting the credit he rightfully deserved, but Walt apparently handing him a pen and a napkin and telling Ub to draw Mickey Mouse for a child at some sort of party? At least that's what the Wikipedia page says. If only I could find a source for this. Fun fact, he was also the one who pushed for Xeroxing animation cells near the middle to the end of the century when the Walt Disney Company really began to take a hit financially for what was the third or fourth time, and ended up having the process covertly tested during Sleeping Beauty. It's not like the man disappeared into the ether after the 30s. He was still quite instrumental to the development of the medium, up until his passing in 1971. Anywho, in order to continue to set the stage for what animation was at the time, we need to briefly mention the Fleischer brothers and Betty Boop. Betty herself went from background character in the Bimbo the Dog shorts, to co-star of said shorts, to standalone success and rival to Mickey Mouse in the animated shorts you would watch before a movie in the late 20s and early 30s. This field was essentially what animation was known for at the time, as that was the main avenue for the medium. No short went beyond several minutes, and gags and songs were the only things really expected out of the output. The Fleischer brothers at this point in time are mostly known for their talkatoons, and the implementation of rotoscope on Coco the Clown shorts. In fact, the combination of the real world and the animated one is something that would continue to develop at the studio until it was dissolved. One of the main reasons for that aforementioned disintegration at the hands of an ever-changing industry, and aspects completely out of Max Fleischer control, being the success of Snow White and the ever-growing pressures on delivering what Paramount considered to be worthy competition. The Fleischer brothers and their rivals, the previously known Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio, would go on to establish that gag-filled short identity. The creation of early Betty Boop shorts involved an animator by the name of Grim Natwick, someone who was considered to be one of the best animators of women at the time, mainly because he was an artist who knew his exaggeration when it came to proportions, having cut his teeth on the previously mentioned Talkatoons, and would continue to experiment with said exaggeration working on UPA cartoons later in his life, but also because of how much his animation played into beauty standards for women at the time. If you've ever wondered where the visual language and animation of men being portrayed as dopey, blobby stickmen and women being curvaceous models came from, Grim Natwick is one of the reasons that language seems to have stuck around. Anyway, the reason I even brought up Grim in the first place is because his other career-defining work, other than animating early Betty Boop and several UPA cartoons, is animating Snow White herself. Snow, being a combination of rotoscoping and traditional hand-drawn animation, leads to a main character in an animated feature that felt more real than anything that had come before. Realism being something that would end up defining an animation theory that many believe is the only real way to animate something in the West for years. As mentioned previously, the idea of Snow White brews in Walt Disney's head for years, while he works on the Alice comedies, several shorts where a real little girl was interacting with cartoons, and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, who helped pave the way for what we understand to be the cartoon shorts of the 30s and 40s. Walt is fired when he asks for higher wages, and Ub Iwerks, being a loyal friend and animator, followed Walt Disney in order to cook up a new idea, and that resulted in Mickey Mouse. First came Plain Crazy, which is, in my opinion, Ub's first real breakthrough with the character, then the big one, Steamboat Willie. The first sound cartoon to really make a splash unlike its predecessor, Fleischer Studios' My Old Kentucky Home. A cartoon which implemented the technology, but without the style and grace of Steamboat Willie. Fun fact, it was the first piece of film to implement the bouncing ball that follows the lyrics to a song. Since Steamboat Willie was a rousing success, the Mickey Mouse shorts continue for years. This is due to the sheer amount of charm and character the shorts had, along with the implementation of very entertaining music and imagery, something that the Silly Symphonies would also have. The Disney studio would cement themselves as the victors in the pre-film animated shorts space in the long term, though it's important to note that the space was not dominated by Mickey Mouse and the Silly Symphonies. I highlight this because I love the Fleischer animated shorts like Betty Boop and their rendition of Popeye, and Felix the Cat also managed to hang in there for a few years. They were revolutionary in their own right. It's important to remember that this is a space that was at the time constantly trying to outdo their competition. This is what a healthy artistic space, for the most part, looks like. At least when you don't take into account the workload that the artists and staff took on with these products. Keep in mind that at the time, the Disney Brothers studios were, for the most part, comfortable in this space, and that rocking the boat was seen by Walt Disney's wife, Lillian Disney, and Walt's brother, Roy Disney, as something that the company shouldn't do, a sentiment Walt himself would basically ignore when he treated his entire animation team to dinner, and then take said team back to the Disney studio in order to reenact the version of Snow White he had in his head at that point. It's been said by several staff members in puff pieces, documentaries, and interviews that if Walt thought his team could pull off a wild idea that he had cooked up, then it was indeed possible. If Walt Disney wanted to make a feature film utilizing a team that, up to this point, cut their teeth on smaller productions, then a company that was, at the time, more known for works like The Band Concert and The Skeleton Dance could somehow pull it off. Which is idealistic, of course, and the movie has existed for years and made the impact that I personally think Walt would be, for the most part, satisfied with. It does go without saying that the dream was easier to pitch than to follow through on. It was easier said than done. This is the section of the video where I make the point that innovation and less than ideal working conditions don't have to go hand in hand. Keep in mind that this part of my rambling is tied into my own personal biases about working conditions. In every Snow White documentary I come across, I always end up happening upon a section where Walt puts his artists back into his own sort of school, and they proceed to study realistic movement. It's how the theory and overall method for the film was perfected. Notable examples include a clip where one actor pretends to have a giant beard, and another showcases an actor with gigantic pants, showing how the folds on clothing work when dancing. It's really impressive, though no matter how impressed I am at the staff of this film's achievements for the time period, it is also startling how they seemingly worked themselves to the bone as well. The staff reportedly worked on the film during the day and studied life at night. Despite my best efforts, I was unable to confirm the toll this put on the staff of the film. Even though it worked out for the company in the long run, I can't help but feel a little horrified at the work schedule the staff must have undergone. I don't really have a point here other than the fact that it isn't necessary to have a crushing schedule to put out great work, even though the work achieved on the film is worth praise many times over. Speaking of the work the team was putting out at the time, if you track the development of the film, you'll continuously come across the same talking points in conjunction with the aforementioned studies of reality. No one believed in the film during the rigorous development, due to the stage that had been set years earlier. It had never been done before, so why would it seem feasible to the audience of the time when the fastest point of comparison to the team's vision were the works of Lotte Reiniger? Rumors would circulate that long periods of time looking at cartoons would hurt your eyes. And not that that's technically untrue, your eyes will obviously be hurt if you look at a screen in the dark for too long, but I digress. The film was called Disney's Folly by numerous people in the film industry and various reporting circles. Meanwhile, during the hellish development of the project itself, the silly symphonies became the testing grounds for ways to make the film better. The sharp progression in technology to tell the story they wanted to tell is staggering. Flowers and Trees from 1932 was the first animated short to showcase the 3-strip Technicolor process in all of its glory. The Goddess of Spring from 1934 presents the studio's attempts at animating people with varied success. The Old Mill from 1937 shows how the multi-plane camera utilizes multiple planes and cameras to make flat paintings seem more like a real world. All of this built up to the release of Snow White on December 21st, 1937. The Carthay Circle Theater is filled with popular Hollywood elites, and the reactions reported from the audience showcase the extent to which the team pushed themselves to create the perfect fusion between the fantastical and the realistic in animation. The team built upon what had been done at the time and went one step beyond, which is why the film was so warmly received by the audience the night of the premiere, and from many audiences after. As I just stated, the film also cemented the extent to which animators and staff would kill themselves to get their product out. The innovation would become the template for the many films that would either take inspiration from it, or would try to take aspects of it without understanding what made it good. Personally, while I can admire the team's achievements all day, I'm not the biggest fan of awarding what seems like a hellish production with accolades validating what seemed like it would be considered back then and today as a bad working environment. Still, the film is the first cel animated feature film. The film inspired a legacy with its powerful imagery. Joe Rosenberg deciding not to shut down production when the company went way over budget is something that saved the film. Another such story is Mary Weiser, who helped figure out how paint would properly function on cells by getting her degree in chemistry, in order for the inking and painting department to properly do their jobs due to the new variety of colors utilized on the picture. Even after the film was completed and had become a hit, it also did well thanks to foreign markets translating it into about 20+ languages. The foreign market itself was an asset that the studio lost only several years later, which is interesting because, as much as the film was groundbreaking, it was also very much in the right place at the right time. So now that the history and development of the film is more or less covered, it's time to delve into the movie itself to show why the many choices made are so powerful and influential. I'm really just gonna ramble about the film and the aspects I like about it for way too long, but I'm sorry. The majestic opening of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is achieved by a booming orchestra to usher in the opening credits. Notably in said credits, a thank you from Walt Disney himself is present. I find that personally interesting because of the Golden Age Disney films, such a note doesn't ever appear again. If you consider Mickey Mouse congratulating Leopold Stokowski in the middle of Fantasia, go right ahead. But having something that's pretty upfront and sincere, given that this movie could have easily destroyed the company, is as striking to me as Squaresoft naming their supposed final game Final Fantasy just in case it was the last hurrah. I also find it fascinating, again, given Walt's history with strikes and the like that would proceed in the following decades. Whenever I reflect on such a note at the beginning of such a bold movie, it's like, this moment really could have been it, huh? Anyway. The prestige and opulence displayed even from the film's first moments through the old European storybook opening showcases that it's not a fun and bouncy cartoon right out of the gate. It's an interesting contrast to what the audience at the time might have expected as well. The beginning of the film is slow, as the camera zooms in on the castle, utilizing the multiplane camera technology in order to lead us into the transition to inside the castle. The slow droning instruments let us know that not all is well. From the opening, we know that the queen is about to consult her magic mirror. The atmosphere is oppressive and creepy. It's very pretty, but the tone is there. Lots of purples and grays, immediately contrasted with the fire that pops out of the magic mirror. The green face with its permanent scowl doesn't evoke any rubber hose exaggerated motions. The restraint is also there in the performance of the evil queen. The imagery of said queen being so intense throughout that the film's release in Britain was messy. I just think it's cool. As we're led outside of the castle, seeing Snow White in her scullery-maid garb, her acting is also there immediately, along with the viewer beginning to settle into the aesthetic version of the German fairy tale. Obviously, in the late 1930s, no one in this American film was going to be speaking German. The film's language and shorthand is more concerned with carrying the Silly Symphony's torch of having Disney create their own version of a place in the world and taking the company's word for it when they say that the story you're watching takes place in a particular location. This is also something that remains consistent in the company, something that the company itself doesn't seem to have fully worked out yet. The scene also contains the first Disney movie song, that song being Wishing Well, followed by the Prince's song titled One Song. The atmosphere at this point has completely transformed from the previous scene. Something about older Disney films that you begin to pick up on the more you repeatedly watch them for a video essay is that the music plays a much more dominant role than it does in their current material. Whether it's the background music or the songs sung by the characters, the entire emotional stance of a scene can shift based on the music. When you begin to consider that, and then think about another golden era Disney film, Fantasia, it's not surprising that these films turned out the way they did. Pretty experimental compared to the Silver Age output, though the good films from that bunch are remarkable for different reasons. The scene's contrast is also important because it's not overly showy, which is what a lot of newer Disney films consider the older catalog to be for some reason. Everything sung by the characters in the film is taken seriously within the context of the film. I almost hate to say this because it's a very obvious remark even for someone like me, but it almost feels like I'm watching a play. A very expressive play with the ability to shift quicker than any stage performance, only flexing when they need to. The radiant nature of this scene isn't undercut by characters remarking about how strange it is that Snow White is singing to doves, or that one of those doves flies down and kisses the prince on what seems to be his teeth? Granted, that brand of humor is funny when done well, but if I had to pick an example that resembles the exact opposite of everything I've talked about, it would be the Slaughter Race song from Wreck-It Ralph 2, which beats itself into the dirt with how much it's a song, guys, get it? It's a song, sung in a cartoon movie, guys. When the evil queen sends the Huntsman to kill Snow White so that she can be the fairest in all the land, we're shown more of a very sincere emotional reaction from the character than you might expect. So far, every character is shown as either all the way good or all the way evil. I just find it interesting that this character is just doing his job and doesn't want to do it. This carries through to other adaptations as well. It's not like Snow White is unique in this aspect at all. I just really like it. It plants the scene that develops and grows for the next scene, which is quite the doozy compared to what we've seen up to this point. The next scene begins with Snow White picking flowers in a field while the hunter looms in the background. I absolutely love how this shot is framed. It's one of my favorite shots in the film. The way Snow White is completely oblivious to the unmoving entity in the background isn't that complicated a message to deliver, and isn't even the most interesting way possible to frame the shot. I just find it interesting because of how it's presented. That being the character of the Huntsman just not moving at all, creates an unease in the scene before the camera zooms in on the character. After helping a baby blue bird find their parents, Snow White is confronted by the hunter. Her very real, palpable scream is what seals the deal for me. One of my pet peeves in animated films is when a character screams, but it's so obviously a fake scream that sounds like a grown adult pretending to be excited at something a child is showing them. The very real emotions shown by these characters is something I find really compelling and interesting when compared to the film's successors and predecessors. Snow White's scream rips away the atmosphere her singing tried to create, along with the huntsman's shadow that creeped into the scene. Another one of my favorite parts of this scene is the huntsman's never come back delivery. The movie is a fairy tale, but it's taken so deathly seriously that it taps into the character's humanity, which is what makes a lot of the early Disney films so compelling. The next part drives up the unease radically. The rudimentary by today's standards lovey-dovey intro is ripped away by the very real emotion of the hunter. And when Snow White runs into the woods, the emotion is ramped up in a way that shows the film's ability to shift an emotion rather naturally. This also has to do with the relationship between the emotions and the music that I mentioned earlier. The symbolic and literal emotion of the character melds together rather nicely in this scene. Nice in a way that captures the progression of the power of cartoons, and exaggeration in general, that this film is really good at. The entire scene is horrifying in a very classical way, I suppose, specifically in that it captures emotions stronger than 7 to 8 minute cartoon shorts shown before features ever could. The advantage being the added scenes of context. The closest parallel I can draw to this scene, from around the same time period anyway, is the Fleischer Brothers' Bimbo the Dog short, Swing You Sinners, from 1930. There's this really great Super iPatchWolf video that talks about the video game Cuphead's art style and the era that inspired it, that being the rubber hose era we focused on earlier. Specifically, he touches on the aspect of early cell animation that anthropomorphized everything. Basically, since animation was still a rapidly developing art form, the rubber hose era of cartoons had a bold experimental aspect to them, where not only were the rules of animation developed, but also the boundaries of what could be animated. The discoveries of these experiments led to the realization that basically anything could be animated and anthropomorphized. This led to the Fleischer Brothers' 1930 cartoon Swing You Sinners, where Bimbo the dog attempts to steal a hen, presumably because the cartoon was created during America's Great Depression in the 1930s, and upon being confronted by law enforcement runs into a graveyard where various graves and ghosts proceed to sing at him about how he shouldn't steal. They also sing about the various ways they are about to kill Bimbo. This anthropomorphized hell nightmare continues into a barn, and then the barn itself starts to chase Bimbo. This continues for several minutes, climaxing with various monsters possibly eating Bimbo, ending the song and the short. Now, the reason I bring up this slightly older cartoon atmosphere is because the terrifying anthropomorphic, scary, singing and dancing creature number is one of the many aspects that people tend to associate with the rubber hose era of the 1920s and 1930s. Other notable examples include the previously mentioned skeleton dance from 1929, the Flip the Frog short Spooks from 1932, Betty Boop's Minnie the Moocher, also from 1932, starring Cab Calloway as a rotoscoped ghost, and another Betty Boop and Cab Calloway collaboration from 1 year later in 1933, titled Snow White. Anywho. The desire for realism in animation expressed by this team for this particular picture, and the past decade and a half or so of spooky animation iconography, collided in this scene where Snow White runs through the woods. Everything seems to have murderous intent. The trees, the branches, the logs that morph into alligators. There's one part where Snow White falls into a hole that's revealed to be a giant monster, and the hole itself is part of its gaping maw. The emotion keeps ramping up until all Snow White sees are gigantic pairs of eyes glaring at her. The sequence ends with her falling to the ground, sobbing. The tone pendulum swings the other way when the animals surround Snow White in the middle of her breakdown. The score swells, and after a brief talk with the animals, the atmosphere is so nonchalant compared to what we were just shown, it's almost like it hadn't happened. I admit, it's really strange, and I can't really act like it isn't, because it's just part of the film's bizarre nature. Emotions switching on a dime because of the character's mood isn't particularly groundbreaking. It's standard storytelling, especially by today's standards when it comes to movies and television. Not that that's a bad thing whatsoever, it's just kind of amusing. The dwarf's house proceeds to be discovered, and after another song that lays the groundwork for over half of the jokes in Enchanted, we're finally introduced to the dwarfs themselves. Hi-Ho is my favorite song in the entire film. Unfortunately, I'm unsure as to why. The combination of the song and the scene, however, is a different story when it comes to articulating how I feel. I haven't remarked upon the level of detail so far in the film that's crammed into every background, as the aesthetic of the movie's visuals is very inspired by classic European storybooks and environmental visuals. It's fit into every nook and cranny of this version of the story. Personally, they're my favorite Golden Age Disney backgrounds due to the staggering level of detail on each one. My favorites are in the Hi-Ho sequence. That being when the dwarfs are walking along the stretch that's able to showcase the waterfall and the wonderful sunset. The sunset paired with the detailed forest is something that I honestly believe belongs in an art museum. And the dwarfs marching along to the song they're singing is just wonderful. The dwarfs themselves, Doc, Happy, Dopey, Sleepy, Sneezy, Bashful, and Grumpy, the only character in the film with any proper development, are also incredibly fun characters to watch. The casual nature of their relationship is something that's so endearing. It also showcases why personality is pretty important to story-driven animated features at this point in history. A commonly utilized comparison is the 1929 Silly Symphony, The Merry Dwarfs. Compared to the older piece, the Seven Dwarfs from Snow White have 7 unique personalities to bounce off of. On top of that, their personalities are instantly recognizable due to the immediate nature of their character designs. The only part of this that, in my opinion, hasn't aged all that well is Dopey. I mean no ill will when I say this, but the more I watch this film, the more I feel the character is a mockery of learning disabled people, which is pretty uncomfortable. The next scene has been dubbed by everyone I show this picture to as the 30-minute scene where nothing happens, which I find pretty inaccurate, seeing as it's only 23 minutes? Alright, this big scene that's in the middle of the film is what I would consider the only pacing flub. Only because of the amount of events that transpire, and there's not really a break in the middle at all, which makes the scene seem longer than it really is. The comprehensive list of the events that happen in this scene are as follows. Snow White and the animals go upstairs. Snow White falls asleep on their beds. The dwarfs approach the house and see that the lights are on. They proceed to analyze the changes in their house for a chunk of time. The animals trick the dwarfs into thinking there's a monster in the house. Dopey goes upstairs to kill the monster. He runs back downstairs thinking there is one. All of the dwarves ambush Dopey and then agree to kill the monster together. The dwarfs encounter Snow White. Snow White wakes up and explains her situation. The soup she made is ready to be eaten. The dwarves' hands are dirty, and Snow forces the dwarves to wash their hands. And finally, the dwarfs wash their hands. Believe it or not, this scene was actually meant to be longer. The dwarfs were all supposed to sit down and eat the soup Snow made for them, complete with an additional song. The animator who worked on this scene, Ward Kimball, worked on it for about an entire year, only for it to be omitted by the scene's completion. You can easily find the scene by searching for it on YouTube. As good as it looks, I can't even say we're missing that much with the scene's omission. Honestly, the entire 23-minute scene feels like it runs way too long anyway. Granted, the amusing antics that the dwarves provide that establish their personalities are entertaining. The way they bounce off of each other only contributes to that. The way Doc flubs his words despite trying to be a bold leader, and Grumpy's seemingly permanent frown just adds to the charm, I'd say. If you want to see a very similar scene like this done totally wrong, then watch the Fleischer Studios' Gulliver's Travels flick. I'm specifically talking about the scene where they encounter Gulliver on the beach and try and get him to the castle. That right there is an example of almost nothing interesting happening for way too long. The only part of this movie that's remotely similar to this long scene is the section later on where, after the singing of the silly song, the dwarves start to fall asleep. Despite the obvious level of quality that this film has in its presentation, it's clearly aged in places. I'm almost tempted to say that scenes like this one I just covered are a result of the changes in audience expectations, and I'm sure that's part of why. However, it's most likely due to the growing pains when it comes to how the Disney studio is trying to figure out how a feature film would even work. What comes next rivals the twisted imagery from any horror movie made up to this point. The evil queen confronts her magic mirror to ask the same question as before, only to find out that the Huntsman did in fact not kill Snow White, and instead was delivered the heart of a pig. After the mirror informs the Queen of Snow White's current location, she marches downstairs into her laboratory. Okay. The long cape, coupled with her rigid posture, sells the stoic yet passionate nature of the character, and the way she walks down the stairs of the dark castle is just so cool. When settled into her laboratory, the queen consults her book of dark magic spells in order to transform herself into a harmless old peddler woman. Many others have compared this scene to scenes in Frankenstein from 1910 and Dracula from 1931. Transformation of the queen itself is such a breakthrough in visual animated imagery that it's one of the other scenes that infamously terrified audiences worldwide when the film was first released. The rising tension in the creation of the magic potion itself through the queen's delivery reading the list of ingredients, combined with the creepy sound effects, ominous music, and unflinching tone creates a perfect blend of its own, while the queen herself is focused on making her own perfect blend. The drinking of the potion is what ties the transformation scene together. The spinning of the location the character is in, followed by a rush of bubbles taking over the screen, makes the transition more into the character seeming to lose control of herself. It marks a shift in the attitude of the character. The look on her face when her hair grows, the satisfaction of her withering state when her hands become decrepit, and the change in her voice complete it all. After hiding behind her clothing, the new character design reveals itself, along with a slight zoom in on her face, showcasing a confident grin. As great as the transformation scene is, I do want to make a point about the design of the Queen's peddler woman form for a minute. Apologies for the witch iconography tangent, but I do feel the need to address the character design of the Queen's transformation. It's been expressed that the evil Queen's design is more or less lifting elements from negative Jewish stereotypes, mainly due to the long nose and black outfit she adorns herself with. I myself am not an authority on Jewish oppression, so it's not really my place to comment on that field. However, I do feel the need to address the fact that the iconography the design presents is more lifted from a general field of negative caricatures of older women from old Europe, rather than just negative traits aimed at Jewish people. Many older European texts present the kind of traits the Evil Queen's transformation showcases as a mockery of older women in general. If you weren't young and beautiful, the natural retort to an image that didn't fit in with what was at the time desired was one found to be ugly and haggard. The imagery of a long nose and withered hands are in contrast to what was expected of women at the time, that being a beautiful face and spry features that would do what was supposedly determined biologically. So the imagery presented in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is more pulling from older misogynistic imagery rather than strictly anti-Jewish imagery, though the possibility of overlap in those two fields varies depending on the time period and who were the scapegoats at the time. While the design does tie into the irony of the Evil Queen as a character, it does lift those Eurocentric beauty standard traits mentioned. I find it perfectly acceptable for anyone to be offended by the design for the myriad of reasons I have brought up. The Queen's transformation and the declaration of her plan is interrupted about halfway through by the silly song sequence I mentioned earlier. Its bouncy nature is in sharp contrast to what we were just shown, in order to give the audience a break from the terror. The more cartoony anatomy of the dwarfs is taken full advantage of here, and the cutting to different shots on beat with the music really begins to take over about midway through. It's one of the best representations I've ever seen on how addicting having fun and dancing to music is. Following the dancing, Snow begins to tell the dwarves about the prince she fell in love with. His name is Florian, by the way. His name isn't important to the film at all, but I find it pretty funny how his name is never mentioned. In comparison to the transformation and the dancing we were just shown, the audience is now treated to restraint in the form of singing, "Someday my prince will come." The expression of the dwarves being captivated by her song is really all we need in order to feel the power of her desire. This is another scene where the imagery was greatly altered based on what was originally storyboarded. Initially, the team had plans for the two to dance in the clouds to this song, but that imagery, along with a myriad of other ideas, were shelved until Sleeping Beauty in 1959. After the sequence where the entire house and all of the animals fall asleep, we are brought back to the Evil Queen. She prepares the apple that will kill Snow White when she takes a bite. She also takes precautions by checking to see if there's an antidote, the only one being love's first kiss. This is something that does not raise much concern in the Queen, because she anticipates that Snow will be buried alive post-apple bite. I really appreciate the acting of the Queen, as she maniacally laughs her entire way down the stairs of her dungeon. She also has a dungeon, complete with skeletons, whose origins are completely unknown. This detail is something that is basically absent from most Disney castles, so I thought it would be an interesting detail to mention, including the excited kicking of a skeleton that adds to the maniacal nature of the character, completely blinded with surface-level beauty. At this point, the movie is nearly over. The dwarves leave to mine for jewels again, and Grumpy is shown to be slowly but surely warming up to Snow White. As Snow stays home to make pies for the dwarfs, the disguised queen approaches, along with two vultures that are ominously watching from the trees. One aspect of her introduction to this scene that I love is the shot-reverse shot that shows both characters' perspectives. Snow White's shock at a stranger in the windowsill is then immediately changed to the queen in her disguise once her shadow enters the previous frame, complete with shocking music to catch the audience off guard. It's a great shot. Despite the animals' best efforts, they are unable to prevent Snow White from being offered the apple. The woodland creatures then decide to get the dwarfs to handle the situation. Once the dwarfs figure out the animals are warning them about the queen, they mount the deer and race back to the cottage, coupled with a fast-paced version of Hi-Ho, which does wonders in getting me excited every time I view this section. The act of coaxing present, resulting in Snow White taking a bite of the poison apple, is something that I would be doing a disservice if I were to address it too quickly. It's intercut several times in the section where the dwarfs are coming back, to obviously drive up the intensity of the sequence, something that must have put audiences of the late 30s on the edge of their seats. In my opinion, it's one of the best moments of the film. This is one of those sequences where, as an audience member, you just want to jump into the film and explain what's happening to the main character before it's too late. Snow White holding up the apple, reciting her wish, and the look of satisfaction on the evil queen as she finally takes a bite, is immediately followed with Snow remarking how she feels strange. The queen repeats the side effects right as Snow White falls to the ground. By the time the dwarves arrive, Snow White has already taken a bite of the apple. Her blood congealed, killing her. As pronounced by the queen immediately afterwards, this makes her the fairest in all of the land. It's not subtle at all, and is remarked upon by basically everyone who's done an analysis of this movie, but the film has done everything in its power to convince us that what the queen says is not the case to the viewer. Lightning strikes as she declares herself the fairest of them all, she laughs maniacally, and leaves Snow White's corpse on the floor. The soundtrack is more menacing than ever. It's pretty clear to anyone watching that the queen's desire for glamour has driven her to kill one of her relatives. Everything menacing seeming to happen at once as the villain achieves their goal is also played into the film's very emotional brand of storytelling. It's also significant, seeing as compared to their competitors, Fleischer Studios, for example, Disney cartoons always had a positive ending. The villain's either thwarted, or the protagonist's goals accomplished, a lesson is learned, a dance ends, everyone turns out to be alright. After the studio built their brand on emotional simplicity offered by their shorts, seemingly turning it around notably left the audience at the premiere shaken. The dwarfs catch up to the queen and corner her on a cliff top. The queen, out of options, turns her attention to a nearby boulder and attempts to push it down onto the dwarfs in order to crush all of them to death. Just when it seems like all is lost, lightning strikes the cliff top that the queen is standing on, causing the stone to collapse, sending her falling to her doom. She lets out a blood-curdling shriek, and the boulder that she planned to kill the dwarfs with falls onto her instead. The dwarfs look down at the scene in shock. We are then shown the vultures that were introduced as onlookers descend into oblivion after what's left of the queen. The scene fades out before we're shown the result of the events that have just transpired. Silence fills the air. The scene slowly fades into the dwarf's cottage. The dwarfs and the woodland creatures observe Snow White's now dead body, as organ music plays in the background. Every character's facial expression is one that's overtaken by sadness and devastation. Combined with the candle wax slowly melting and the rain outside, it makes it seem as though everything is crying. Compared to the dancing we were shown earlier, the amount of contrast this scene provides is one of the most notable aspects of the picture. It's a very still scene, one that just allows the audience to take in the result of the conflict. It's a fairy tale, played deathly straight. Just as slowly as we were brought into the scene, the camera zooms out, the organ music fades as well, and that's it. The audience at the premiere was reportedly crying at this sequence. Again, compared to what the company had offered up to this point, such powerful, poignant imagery hadn't really been attempted yet. It's truly an achievement. Storybook narration takes the viewer deep into the forest. The dwarfs didn't have the heart to bury Snow White, and so instead built a glass coffin where they could always look over her. The way this shot, just like the rest of the film, contains so many little details always blows me away. It's remarkable how beautiful and sad a group of artists are able to make a sequence, and still have those little emotional moments where you can tell their hearts and souls were just crammed into every little frame. Details like the name on the coffin, the leaves and petals slowly falling to the ground, the level of detail in the trees, and how gentle the light comes through and rests on the scenery, the dwarfs slowly walking into frame, the fact that their posture resonates with the music and tone perfectly, the fact that Grumpy is the one to put the flowers onto Snow White who now rests on the coffin, showing how he can't hide his affection for her anymore, the animals surrounding the scene bowing their heads alongside the dwarfs, it's all tied together by the music being a reprise of Prince Florian's earlier song. One song, the prince slowly walks down the hill and takes the viewer's attention in the frame. Just as slowly and gently as the dwarfs, he approaches the glass coffin where Snow White resides, and kisses her. He too bows his head along with everyone else. The choir in the background forces us to stew on the scene, until they all start singing in unison. Someday my prince will come, the song Snow sang not too long ago. This finally completes the song, and shows Snow White's affection for Florian in return, as she finally wakes up, followed by the two uniting, and the dwarfs and animals rejoicing. At this point, the sound effects have completely dropped out, and the music has taken over. Snow White finally mounts Florian's horse and kisses all of the dwarfs goodbye. The two ride off together into a castle in the clouds, as the choir repeats the lines sung by Snow White earlier in the film. As the castle dominates the frame, it fades out to the book that brought us into the film, stating the classic line, "And they lived happily ever after." The book closes, and the choir reaches the song's finale, ending Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Reports say that the opening night audience gave a standing ovation by the end of the film, which is quite the turnaround when you consider some of the first reactions to the picture's announcement. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is one of the most important animated films ever made for a reason. Not only did it define the identity of one of the most important animation houses ever created, but the innovations the film brought to the table when considering realism and detail in the aesthetic, and the engaging narrative was something that tried to be emulated for years. The place this film has in history and development of the medium is critical, as the film went on to inspire many projects and artists' careers, which wouldn't have happened if the film itself wasn't great and worth watching over and over again. To this day, I am unsure why I ended up so drawn to this film. Perhaps it has to do with the amount it accomplished in the era it was created. Maybe I just love it because it has so much love and energy poured into it than I thought an old film could manage when it first caught my eye in 2014. It's that spark of inspiration and passion that no remake could ever manage. Though I'm sure the amount of overwork will inevitably carry through to whatever staff ends up working on the reinterpretation. Regardless of the soon-to-be existence of such a film, it doesn't change the fact that the 1937 classic defined the generation it was released in, and it also defined the studio that released it. The film being so important to the people who would come to work in the industry afterwards, that it became the benchmark to dethrone for years. While newer films in the Disney catalog are engaging for completely different reasons, and those newer films being more attractive to audiences now, I still believe that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs deserves to be more appreciated today. That it was such a culmination of everything the Walt Disney Studio managed to achieve at the time, pushed as far as possible, makes it one of the best and most enduring family films ever made. Though it's aged in places, the film is still worth a watch today. It comes highly recommended for anyone who's a fan of family films and great filmmaking. I can only hope that it's obvious at this point when I say that the film inspired entire generations of artists. Hardworking people built from where this film left off for years to get where we are now. And where we are now is... yes. Thank you to anyone who listened to me ramble for way too long about a film that not many people really care about nowadays compared to, of course, newer films that are also deserving of attention and praise. This is just something I really wanted to make, just because of how much I love the film, and I just needed to put all of the reasons I liked the film into one place, just to get it all out, just get it out of my system, and hopefully it turned out alright. If you are listening to this right now, it means you watched to the end, so you have my immense gratitude. I'll say it again. Thank you for listening to me ramble for way, way too long, and I can only hope it was entertaining in some way. That's all I really have to say, because this is my first attempt at something like this, and I can only hope it turns out well enough that I do more in the future, as I would like to do more. But, that's all I really have to say, so, thank you for watching, and, yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching.